Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Leah with Headwaters Science Institute. We are very sorry about some technical difficulties this morning, just ironing out a few kinks, and now we're ready to go. Super excited in just a moment to present to you Kurt Sable with the U.S. Forest Service. Before we get into that, I just want to remind you that it's giving season, and we are able to keep these talks free through donations from watchers like you. So if you are able to make a donation to support these kinds of free talks that expose kids to hands-on science, you can head to headwatersscienceinstitute.org/donate. Now, to get into the real meat of what we're doing today, Kurt Sable has been a hydrologist with the U.S. Forest Service for over 17 years. He's worked for 3 national forests, and he initiates and manages watershed restoration projects, and he conducts analysis for water and soil, all things that happen on the National Forest System lands, which include logging, fuel work, recreation, and more. And in addition to that, he works on burned area response teams. And this fall, he spent 14 days working as the lead resource advisor on the North Complex fire, which, as you may know, was the 6th largest fire in California's history. So, super relevant topic, something we're all concerned about every summer. So we're really excited to welcome Kurt Sable. Hi, Kurt.
Hello, how's it going?
Great to have you today.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to let you launch into your presentation.
Okay, yeah, as Leah mentioned, I'm a hydrologist. I work for the Plumas National Forest on the Mount Hope Ranger District, which is up here out of Quincy, an hour and a half north of Tahoe. And got to wear my uniform today. Just wanted to point that out because I haven't worn it since COVID started, working at home and whatnot. So what I wanted to talk to you today about, and what I was hearing a lot of interest, is these effects of these wildfires on the landscape. So I wanted to start with what are land managers worried about after, these large wildfires. And it's a big topic. So an introduction, in the short term, we do a lot of, when we get these bigger fires, we try to involve resource people that work, with natural and cultural resources, and get them involved right from the get-go, fighting the fire, trying to reduce damage and fight the fire, steering the dozers away from sensitive areas. We repair, the suppression, the damage from suppressing the wildfire. We do this, we form these teams called Burned Area Emergency Response Teams. We like acronyms here in the Federal Service, so that's BEAR. In the long term, we're worried about those longer term impacts to the ecosystem, and want to just reiterate here that not all fire is bad. We live in a fire adapted landscape here in Northern California. And maybe one of the reasons we're in this predicament is that we haven't had enough fire on the landscape in the last 100 years. But they do seem, for a number of reasons, to be getting larger and more severe. And some of that may be due to climate change, of course. We also, in the Forest Service, look at potentially getting some of that fire-killed timber to the lumber mills so we can, use it, build houses with it. And we want to restore those ecosystems and balance all those needs. Severity and scale matter with these wildfires. You may have just a few trees burned in some areas, and you can let it burn or put a hand line around it with just hand tools. Or the North Complex, recently we had here on the forest, there was 360 miles of dozer line. And for those of you who don't know what a dozer line is, you can see it as a picture. It's basically like a road built in a hurry by dozer to try to break up the fuel and contain the fire. We also are going to look at, how severe was the fire to the soils and to the vegetation. Did it burn and kill everything? Did it affect the soils? So here is the Illilouette Basin in Yosemite, and this is an area where we've actually let fire play its role on the landscape for the last 100 years or whatnot. And you can see there's still severe fire that killed a patch of trees, but it's a small patch of trees. You can see there's some new trees starting to pop up and some nice wildfires or flowers. And you can see some, live trees right in the background that help reseed this area. And this is some hotter fire here on the Plumas. There's no live trees here, and it could be, it might take longer for this area to recover to a forest. And there might be some erosion issues in that little swale. Likewise, here's a picture from the air of the North Complex on the east side, and an area of the fire that didn't all burn at once. There was some hot patches you can see up in the, let's see, do I have a little pointer? Up here, you can see some, little hotter areas here on the south-facing slopes, but there's still trees on the bottom and the top to provide seeds. And you got a lot of forest left here on the north-facing side. So that fire took a run. I even had to evacuate from my house in Quincy, and then we thought it was starting to look like it was in decent shape. And then we got one of these northeast wind events, similar to what happened at the campfire that burned down Paradise. And it was actually a really clear day in Quincy because the wind was blowing the smoke the other way. And I'd been choking on smoke for so long, like so many of us. I went for a run up to this peak, Spanish Peak, and got a view of the fire and was like, uh-oh, that does not look good. This was September 8th, and it made almost a historic run of close to 200,000 acres in like 30 hours. And this is when Berry Creek and lost like 2,000 structures and 8 lives. This is the lower middle fork of the Feather Canyon. That last picture was or 2 pictures ago was the upper. And here, there's still at least needles here, but this is mostly all just burned up on both sides of the canyon. Not a lot of seed resources and stuff for that landscape to recover as fast. And we may have some erosion issues. So back to how we organize ourselves here. We, in the post-fire, we're going to get on repairing some of that damage from the fire suppression activities. And Courtney Rowe, who's a colleague of mine, did a really good talk. I think it was Lunch with a Scientist, episode 10, I believe. So you want to learn more about that. And she's really good with her fire ecology as well. So that's a great talk. We can identify, we'll want to identify imminent post-fire threats to life, safety, and property. I'll get more into that with an example I have. And then some threats to natural and cultural resources. Heritage sites, especially like ARC sites, are irreplaceable. So those are a big concern. We try to take immediate actions where we have unacceptable risk. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Here's an example of one of our operation maps. So all these little lines, these are roads, but these are dozer lines here that were just put on the landscape. You'll notice that this is the edge of the fire, but we built what we call contingency lines. So we have lines away from the fire that were put there just in case it kept moving and we weren't able to hold it. And this is to protect Bucks Lake and Meadow Valley, which is up here. And you can see down here, there's just like a bunch of these lines. We at one point had 100 bulldozers running around in the forest, just causing all kinds of havoc, but trying to get control of the fire. So moving on to a specific example, this is this cute guy is the arroyo toad that lives down in Southern California. And I was asked to go down there to the Thomas Fire, which at that point, back in 2017 or whatnot, was one of the largest wildfires in California history, and did some suppression repair. And this is a contingency line. So the dozer line is coming right down this ridge, and some folks saw this from the air. Down here is critical habitat for this endangered toad. So they lived down here, and they didn't want them to get buried. They didn't want water to come down this dozer line and go off this really steep hill and cause havoc and bring a bunch of sediment down here. And ordinarily, we would bring in bulldozers or excavators to do this repair and try to build water bars and make sure the water goes where we want it to. But in this case, this is way back, like 8 miles into some wilderness area. We didn't have time to bring equipment in because, lo and behold, there was a predicted large rainstorm on the way. So given that, we used this K-Max helicopter to bring in some 38 bales of straw, weed-free straw, and T-posts. And we took OHVs, these razors, back in there with hand crews and built water bars by hand with hand tools and backing them up with straw bales. Kind of a fun, as the hydrologist, I got to design this project. Here's one of our finished water bars, basically shunting that water away from that steep slope. Some of the people I got to work with down there, and T-post trying to back that up. It was quite a day, as also that storm was on the way, and the last OHV that we had in there, it turned out somebody had put saw gas in it, and it wouldn't start. We were 8 miles back in the wilderness, 4:30 on a January day, but luckily a helicopter came and picked us up. So still with the Thomas Fire, so often we have to worry more about this life, property, and infrastructures before we do the wildlife and natural resources. And depending on how much time we have, we can do some engineering solutions, or we can just use information. So this is on top of a ridge, this picture. Down here is the town of Montecito and Oprah Winfrey's house and a bunch of others. This is fog. This is the Channel Islands and the Pacific Ocean. And this is 3,000, 4,000 feet of relief. And this hillside is just completely burned up. So no vegetation left on there. So just to back up a little bit to that burned area emergency response, we'll start with information from satellite imagery where we looked at reflectance, and the reflectance can be a surrogate for how hot the fire burned, and it's a first cut of our soil burn severity, and soil burn severity matters because of its response to rainfall. So we'll get an initial map, and we'll oftentimes go out in a helicopter flight to look at, we'll bring the satellite, the first cut map with us from the satellite. And this is my colleague Kelby and I up in a helicopter looking at a fire called the Minerva Fire, and look at these burned areas and get a feel for what's in the way if we get rain below the hot parts of the fire. We'll often also go in the field and look at hydrophobicity. So here we are, when vegetation burns hot, it'll often put this chemical residue down into the soil. And that, if it isn't broken up, can kind of form an impervious area, or area that does not accept water as readily as would be the natural condition. So you can see there, less than 1 minute, there's none. We watch these drops of water, and we'll do that at different layers down in the soil. And that'll help us kind of gauge that map, that accuracy of that soil burn severity map as well. So back to the Thomas Fire, that information from that soil burn severity will go into this other model from the United States Geologic Survey. And that's a model that also looks at rainfall for that area and topography, and we'll slap a debris flow probability. So debris flow is a mudslide. It's where we get really dangerous erosive events and earth movement. And some of you may know the history of this, where we're going. This is Montecito. These are all basically like houses that were destroyed when this happened, I was actually sitting in a hotel in Santa Barbara right over here, trying to write a report when this was happening. We were all just pulled out of the woods, and here we got 0.8 of an inch of rain pretty much in 15 minutes, which is really a worst case scenario. This is way over the thresholds. The model predicted, a third of that could cause issues. But so it was just this rainfall came right off the Pacific and delivered a lot of rain very quickly. And it caused this, and pretty sad. 20 people died. And, as land managers, all we could do is work with, the county and the town about emergency services and just trying to get people to leave and express, what a concern this was. And that did occur. A lot of people did evacuate, but a lot of people did stay. It was worse in some areas than we thought it would be and better in others, but there was a blanket warning for debris flows. Oprah's house only got damaged slightly, I believe. So that's if, we basically had no time to do anything on the landscape. There are some things, if you do have more time and lots of money, you can build like these large cable structures. They're not perfect. You got to make sure they're in the right place. And you got to maintain them and clear them out. In the past with burned area emergency response, we've thrown straw mulch out of helicopters to just try to get that ground cover up to try to address that rainfall impacts and decrease, give the water more time to infiltrate. We've also done contour falling, where you dig trenches, drop trees, try to just break up flow. A lot of this, though, it turned out it's really expensive and not always all that effective. So we're not doing as much of it anymore. Infrastructure is an issue. If we wash out roads, it can also affect the road itself and downstream aquatic creatures, that are, once again, could get buried. So fire can deliver a lot of debris that'll plug culverts where roads are trying to drain and sediment, and that caused this washout here. Nowadays in burned area emergency response, just to protect our infrastructure, a lot of times we'll do things like this, where we, instead of just having culverts with a stream crossing, we also put like a snorkel or a vent on it. So if this gets plugged, hopefully the water can go, right through this top part of this pipe and not wash out the road and deliver a bunch of sediment to the stream. So now kind of drilling down more on what wildfire means to aquatics. Leah had mentioned, that people are wondering about the impacts of natural resources from these fires. And once again, it really depends. Frogs and fish that live in these streams, they don't like to have their homes buried, just like those folks in Montecito. And especially both frogs and fish like to, their refuge is a lot of times the deep pools, and a lot of sediment can fill those in, at least in the short term, with that extra sediment. This is Indian Creek right here by Quincy, that was affected by thunderstorms this summer after the Walker fire, which was a fire we had on the forest on the east side last year, and delivered a lot of sediment there. We don't have these on this forest. We do have them on my neighboring forest to the north on the Lassen, but this is threatened species, Chinook salmon. And it is really interesting response, because there's some research showing that some Chinook salmon actually prefer streams that have been burned over and have extra wood. And a lot of times, at least after a runoff season or two, you'll remove the fine sediment and you'll be left with good spawning gravels. So it can, these species are adapted to these impacts in certain discrete events, and it can really diversify the habitat and make things in places better for them. One thing riparian areas have going for them is they have water. So you can burn up a riparian area and it'll come back fairly quickly. And that kind of young riparian vegetation can really benefit some species. This is an area that will be disturbed by fire and flood. So it's kind of adapted to having those disturbances. And some of this open area, frogs actually can use when they need to sit on a rock and get their blood warmed up, since they are a cold-blooded species. So we'll move on to terrestrial wildlife. Not my area of expertise, but I'm sitting in these meetings and learn about this stuff across all disciplines. These huge wildfires like the North Complex, September 8th, direct mortality is an issue. Creatures just can't get out of the way fast enough in a real fast-moving wildfire. So there's a crispy deer right here. There's been orphaned animals. This is a bobcat named Chips, named after the Chips fire that burned here on the forest a few years back. Had some issues with its eyes and no parents. Went to the Wildlife Recovery Center in Tahoe and then got adopted, I believe. And then this is the original Smokey the Bear from the 50s, who was orphaned and had some fur burned up and then was brought back to health and went around and became Smokey the Bear, our mascot. And then, forest, we have creatures and life stages of creatures that are all adapted to these different, what we call seral stages. You have down here, you have shrubs and seedlings and grass, and then you start getting small trees and bigger trees and bigger trees, and you kind of get that late mature forest. And, depending on how bad the fire is, you may be left with some of these elements after a wildfire, or you may kill it all and send it back to here. Here's my wife, Gretchen, with she has in the past worked with spotted owls. Here she has given a California spotted owl a mouse, and they go chase them back to their nest to figure out where they live. And they really like old growth forest and mature forest, and they like forest with a lot of a multi-tiered kind of canopy is where they like to live. Kind of a flammable forest, really. So this is some of the challenges we're dealing with. They definitely don't do well if their stand is wiped out by a high severity wildfire. On the right here, this is the blackback woodpecker. So it likes high severity wildfire and lots of dead trees, because these guys, some types of these fire chaser beetles, can detect this dead wood and forest fire they can see forest fire with these infrared sensors from like 75 miles away. It's pretty amazing. And they just start flying there to go chew on the dead wood, and then the blackback woodpecker will eat them. So yeah, just to reiterate, and even the spotted owl will live here, but sometimes hunt over in here. So it's quite complicated. These large wildfires aren't good for a lot of species, but it is a complex response. And, as land managers, we're worried about other things. Invasive plants. This is a picture of cheatgrass burning. This stuff can come in after a fire, especially in the desert or Great Basin kind of environment. And it dries out quickly in the spring and can just kind of perpetuate a fire cycle. It doesn't allow other things to establish. So we fight invasives. We decide whether we want to go in and cut the dead trees, and potentially we can actually make some money with that if we can get them in time before they degrade, send them to the mill. Sometimes controversial. It can it doesn't make those blackback woodpeckers happy if you cut all the dead forest down right away. But you can also set up the landscape to let people come in and plant where the snags aren't going to fall on them. So they can try to beat back the brush and try to make it become a forest a little bit quicker than if you just left this. Eventually, this could be forest again. but it will take a long time for the seedlings to outcompete the brush and the other species. And here you can kind of get a jump on it and make it forest sooner. Although with climate change, there's a potential that some of these areas are headed to a different state of maybe a oak woodland instead of a conifer forest, especially in the lower elevations. But like I said before, it seems like these fires are getting, well, worse. They're getting larger and more with higher proportion of high severity. So looking at this list, it's pretty crazy. The last five of the biggest of the 10 biggest of the 10 biggest wildfires in California history happened this summer. And right here is the North Complex. Right here is the Thomas Fire from 2017. So what are we worried about? We're worried about a lot of things. And this is how this summer felt. So to bring that to a conclusion, you know, natural resources, we often have to take a back seat to human life and property now when we're burning down towns and burying towns. I had thought of a quick example of campfire where we're really worried about water quality coming off of a burned up town, right? But as it turns out, we couldn't really find much, or these researchers couldn't find really bad stuff getting into the West Branch, Feather, and other rivers around there. But their water quality system, or their water system to deliver drinking water, really was messed up because bad chemicals got sucked in there as it kind of depressurized during the fire. So once again, humans are really feeling the effect, and their water system is messed up. Natural systems, you know, they often recover from these discrete disturbances like those salmon. But, you know, long-term change and over huge areas can really push systems across thresholds and become something different and not a forest anymore. And once again, you know, it just depends on how that fire burned and what happened. And, you know, one thing we just really got to realize, fire is not going to go away. That's pretty evident. And we really need resilience. We need resilience in our setting up our ecosystems and in our human ecosystem. Some things we're trying to do, you know, proactively, of course, is we need to use every tool we have. So prescribed fire or, you know, adequate, some wildfire, we should respond into such a way to where if we can use the fire to achieve some resource objectives, we should potentially, you know, build a dozer line a little bit further away. If we can let an area burn, we have to be really careful with that. And then we can get out and do some mechanical treatment and potentially, you know, send some wood chips to a power plant or logs to a mill and reduce the fuel. And I think one thing we really need to do in California is really look at how we set up where we live and even build structures that are less susceptible to burning down and treat right next to our houses is the most important thing we can do to keep them from burning down. And kind of back also on that tangent, we have, you know, a fire suppressed forest. We've been talking about this where we have been putting out fires for 100 years. So you have a lot of this excess fuels and really complex fire, really complex forests with a lot of chances for fire to leap from here into the canopy of these larger trees. It burns at high severity. You're left with nothing. We can get out ahead with fire and or mechanical treatment. And you can hopefully set up the forest to where it can burn and it's not as destructive, and you're left with some, you know, some patches of high severity that are good for those blackback woodpeckers and some patches of trees that are still good for like those spotted owls. And also it's a forest where a lot of us like to spend more time with trees as opposed to, you know, those snags, dead trees and brush, which is another scenery we need to get used to and we're seeing a lot more of. So that's about all I have for this little slideshow. So I'll leave it at that. Tried to cover a lot of things.
That's great, Kurt. Thank you so much. I think a lot of us kind of know what to do to protect human lives, but we don't know exactly what to do for the environment. So it's really great to hear some of the things that you're working on.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and invite the audience to send in some questions. I know we did have a couple come in during the talk. So
somebody stuck around during our technical difficulties.
Yeah, they check it out. This one's from Griffin Toscano. How long has the Forest Service been clearing up after its firefighting activities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's been the intent for a long time. We didn't used to have such big wildfires and make such big messes. But I think like knowing that we need to like water bar the lines around the fire and whatnot has been going on pretty much from like the 50s and 60s, and we probably didn't do as good a job, but we didn't have as big of messes back then. So it's kind of, we've ramped up and gotten more ologists involved as the wildfires have become a bigger deal. So, it's been in there for a long, long time that we need to do something with those suppression repair.
And I also wondered on that tangent, you talked about putting in things like those cable structures or drains in fire-sensitive areas. Do you put those in before the fire, knowing that there may be a fire there someday? Or do they go in after and they kind of stay there for if it should happen again?
Yeah, no, that's those are generally going to go in after the fire. That's part of that bear and wort. The state of California calls it Watershed Emergency Response Team. They got their own acronym, but those will happen after the fire. Hopefully you have time. Like we didn't have time at that Thomas fire for anything like that. And they're expensive. That some of them were put in up on the Carr fire near Redding. That cost millions. And it's interesting, different geology. They got big rainstorms. They literally got like tablespoons of sediment, where in Southern California, they buried houses. So we're pretty judicial. You don't just put those anywhere because it's a pretty expensive infrastructure.
I see. And I wanted to ask you something that maybe some of our students watching might be curious about. I think that you've used a lot of improvisation and kind of a multidisciplinary approach to some of these suppression relief techniques that you talked about, like when you were talking about how you improvised that solution for the frog habitat. Can you tell us more about how you've used a bunch of kind of different areas of experience in your career to create solutions like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great part of like working as a land manager, but also having this specialty. Like, I went to school for geosciences and have really worked on water and rivers and whatnot. But I work side by side with botanists and ecologists and whatever, and married to a wildlife biologist. So, yeah, so basically you're just going to, have your toolbox developed and try to huddle up and use what needs doing. As a hydrologist, I've definitely had to learn a lot about some things about botany, because if I'm trying to prevent erosion, I need vegetation. Mm-hmm. So how best to do that? We talk to, plant people, and so that's just kind of a general thing, that Thomas fire where we had to use the helicopter. It was kind of like huddling up and seeing what resources we have, talking to the fire people to see what they can help us with, the heavy lifting, including helicopters and OHVs, and talking to people who've done lots of suppression repair and resource advising. And we came up, with a plan to protect those arrow toads. It was not cheap. But in the big scale of fighting 200,000 acre wildfires. It also is a small percentage. So it was kind of an interesting deal there because you were doing this project to protect these toads away from the fire. And we did that, and a town got buried, by debris flows, but there was really not much we could do except get people out of the way and use information because there was no time to do anything on that huge a scale. So it is interesting, the battles you pick and the team you put together.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers that question.
It does. It sounds like a lot of teamwork from different experts, and you don't always know what's going to happen in the end, but you were able to protect those frogs. So that's something at least.
Right.
So another question, what exactly makes the culverts fill after fires?
Well, it's kind of a combination. Usually you just get a lot of like woody debris, and whether you salvage log or not, you get killed brush and then extra sediment. So that can be a really, bad 1-2 punch for culverts, is they'll get woody debris like branches and stuff, like bridge across them and plug them, and then you have extra sediment from the bare slopes, and that'll cause a dam. And you may also actually the third wheel there is the extra water you get off the landscape when you don't have the infiltration. So all those three of that together will overwhelm the culvert. Sometimes they'll just fill with sediment if they're just overwhelmed with sediment, but a lot of times it's woody debris will plug them. They won't even be actually, full, but they'll be plugged, and then the water will go elsewhere and take out the road.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And I wonder, does that have a trickle-down effect for other parts of the watershed?
Oh, yeah, certainly. A worst case scenario, a lot of times a road will be, going downhill, and you'll have a stream crossing, and then instead of the water going through the culvert, it'll jump on the road and go. I've seen them where the water has gone into a completely different watershed, gulling out the road, and then it'll dive off the road and just take a lot more sediment than would have happened if it just would have gone in its regular path, and it'll take out the road and deliver a lot more sediment to the channel down below the road and fill in pools or potentially cause more issues for whatever's down there.
Interesting. So another question I think might inspire our students watching here, as a hydrologist, how did you end up working in fire, and how do those things work together?
Yeah, Courtney addresses this in her talk as well. Working for the Forest Service and the land manager, it's just one thing. It's a little bit necessity. Like, fire is what is happening. I've always been involved with fire from the get-go, especially that burned area emergency response, because a lot of times we're asking a central office for money to help do some of those projects, and we justify it with hydrologic response, doing those models. And that's something, as part of my education as a hydrologist, I learned stuff about hydrologic models and how you get water increase and sediment increase if you remove vegetation and ground cover. So that's how I kind of got in. And then a lot of these fires, as I said, because it's complicated, and you get a lot of the fire, it burns the landscape, but it's not that big a deal for erosion or water runoff if you have at least the high severity patches that are small, or you got really good fire effects. It really doesn't change the hydrology too much. But if you went and took a bulldozer through the woods and cut down the trees and ripped out the stumps and removed the vegetation with those things, I started realizing a lot of fires, that's more important almost. So I started getting into resource advising. And Courtney really talks about this well in her talk about, then you're trying to steer the fire organization when they're kind of getting bored towards the end of the fire and they're getting it under control, to no, this is really important. And you really try to keep that equipment out there, and you try to repair those lines and get them to where they're not such an impact erosion wise, ecologically. We try to get ground cover back on those dozer lines, where they're not on roads, where they don't belong. So they'll, at least hopefully recover someday and get vegetation response. So I just saw it as really important. And, unfortunately here on the Plumas, between the Walker Fire and North Complex now, almost a third of we have a 1.1 million acre forest here, and almost a third of it's burned in 2 seasons. So fire is just what is happening on the landscape. So we need to be involved.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very well said by a STEM professional, giving us really scientific reasons why we should care about fire if we don't know already. Super relevant talk. Thank you, Kurt.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you want to check out more Lunch with the Scientist, you can find Kurt's talk and other archives on our website. You can find Courtney Rao's talk, which Kurt referenced today. We've got another talk that was done recently about the impacts of wildfire smoke by Colleen Reed. So lots more to learn about fire and why it's an important thing to care about in today's world, although maybe an unfortunate thing. So Kurt, thank you so much. I hope you have a great day.
All right, you too. Thank you.